Northamptonshire, England, September 1989. Inside Althorp, the ancestral home of the Spencer family, the staff are preparing for a wedding. At the foot of the entrance hall, a floor of black and white marble. Rising out of it, a broad oak staircase and generations of painted Spencer faces watching from the walls. At the top of that staircase, two women stand very close together. One is 60 years old, the Countess Spencer, the woman who runs this house. The other is 28. She has come home for her brother's wedding, and she is, at this moment, the most photographed woman in the world. The younger woman's voice rises. The words are about the house and the money and her father. Then she reaches out, puts both hands on the older woman, and shoves. The Countess goes down the stairs. The woman who fell was Raine, Countess Spencer. The woman who pushed her was her stepdaughter, Diana, Princess of Wales. For years, the world had known the Spencer as 500 years of English aristocracy. Old land, inherited titles, and a shy young daughter who had married the heir to the throne. That was the photograph everyone saw. This was the house behind it. What follows is the story of those two women. How they came to be standing at the top of that staircase, and how, against everything 2 decades of feuding had built between them, they would end up on the other side of it before Diana's life ran out. It is a story about a father, a house, and the long, quiet war over what a family is allowed to keep, and what it is finally forced to let go. To understand how they got there, you have to go back. Past the wedding, past the marriage that started the feud, to a family that was already broken long before Raine Spencer ever walked through the door. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 in Norfolk, the third daughter of a family that had badly wanted a son. When she was 6 years old, the marriage of her parents collapsed. What followed was not a quiet parting. It was a bitter divorce and then a bitter fight over the children. Diana's mother, Frances, left, and in the custody battle that came after Frances lost, she lost Diana and Sarah and Jane and the youngest Charles. In one of the more painful turns of that fight, Frances' own mother, Diana's grandmother, testified against her own daughter. The record does not permit a diagnosis of Diana from this distance, and it would be unfair to attempt one. But the record shows this much. Diana and her little brother Charles lived through their parents' marriage coming apart. They were shuttled between divided households, and for the rest of their lives, they remembered that stretch of childhood as something that had hurt. That was the foundation for everything that came later. What a child in that position wants, more than money, more than status, is a family that will not vanish, a family that will not be dismantled and rearranged around her. And the woman Diana would come to hate did not create that wound. The wound was already there. Raine walked into a family that had already broken years before she arrived. What she became was the face of the break, the person all that old pain could finally attach itself to. The man in the middle of it was Edward John Spencer, known to almost everyone as Johnny. He was born in 1924, educated at Eton and then at Sandhurst, the military academy. He served in a cavalry regiment, the Royal Scots Greys, and later spent time as an equerry, a kind of personal attendant, first to King George VI and then to Queen Elizabeth II. The family had been woven into the royal world long before Diana ever married into it. In 1975, Johnny's father died. Johnny inherited the earldom and the estate, and his 14-year-old daughter Diana became overnight Lady Diana Spencer. Johnny's position was the reason the whole thing became so hard to untangle. This was never a simple matter of stepmother against children. It was a triangle in which the father kept choosing the wife the children could not stand, and kept defending her publicly to the end. Whatever Johnny wanted from his later years, companionship, some vitality, a realistic way to keep a hugely expensive inherited house from bankrupting him, he found it, and the person he found it with was the one his children could never accept. There was the brother, too. Charles Spencer, born in 1964, 3 years younger than Diana. Every account of that childhood describes the two of them as allies, the two youngest, bound together while the adult world came apart above their heads. That bond mattered, because when the hostility toward Raine took shape, it was not Diana's alone. It was theirs, together. And Charles would grow up to become the most public keeper of that grievance, a role made complicated years later when he inherited Althorp himself and discovered exactly how hard it was to keep alive. And there was Frances, the mother. It would be easy to file her away as backstory, the woman who left. She was more than that. Her departure, the custody she lost, her fractured place in her children's lives, all of it stayed live for decades. When the worst confrontation of the whole story finally erupted, the trigger was not money or furniture. It was Frances. It was Diana's fury at what she believed Raine had done to her mother. In 1975, then, 14-year-old Diana arrived at a house old enough to feel permanent, its clocks ticking, its ancestral portraits watching, while the actual family inside it was anything but permanent. One relative later remembered the place as intimidating and almost frozen, still locked in the era of their grandfather. That was the contradiction the whole story ran on. The house said that nothing ever changed. The family said that everything already had. And then within a year of Diana walking through those doors, another woman would walk through them too, not as a guest, but as the new Countess Spencer. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. Raine was born on the 9th of September, 1929. Her mother was Barbara Cartland, the wildly prolific romance novelist and one of the most famous authors in Britain. Her father was Alexander McCorquodale. And here the parallel with Diana becomes hard to ignore because Raine's parents' marriage had also fallen apart while she was young. Two women, a generation apart, both marked early by a father's absence and a family that did not hold together. The parallel should not flatten them into the same person, though, because they responded in almost opposite ways. Diana became famously emotionally open, someone who wore what she felt, who reached for people, who could make a stranger feel seen. Raine became something else entirely. She turned herself into an operator, relentlessly capable, socially formidable, a woman who got things done. Raised largely by governesses, sent to Canada for part of the Second World War, presented to society in 1947 and named Debutante of the Year, she did not settle into decoration. She went to work. She entered local politics and became the youngest councillor in Westminster in the 1950s. She served on the London County Council and later the Greater London Council, and she built a genuine career around heritage, planning, and tourism, the machinery of preserving old buildings and running things properly. In 1948, she married Gerald Legge and had 4 children, in her own later telling that marriage was not some cold arrangement she was waiting to escape. She spoke of it warmly. That matters because it complicates the lazy version of the story, the one in which a scheming woman trades up for a grander title. By her own account, what happened with Johnny was not calculation. It was something that hit her all at once, an attachment she described as immediate and overwhelming. If Diana's deepest want was a family that would not disappear, Raine's was different. Raine wanted to be useful, indispensable, effective. She wanted to walk into a situation that was failing and fix it. First in public life, and then at Althorp. She met Johnny in the early 1970s. Both were still married to other people. Both of those marriages ended, and in 1976, Raine and Johnny married each other. Diana had just turned 15. To Johnny, it appears to have been one of the happiest relationships of his life. To his children, it felt closer to a second demolition. The first family had already been taken apart by divorce. Now a new woman was moving into the house, into their father's life, taking a place none of them had offered her. They had a name for her: Acid Raine. It could read as a piece of cruel royal wit, but it was something colder than that. It was 4 siblings forging a shared language of resistance, a private code that turned resentment into something they held in common. When a family gives someone a name like that, they are drawing a line and putting that person permanently on the other side of it. And then Raine did what Raine did. She organized. At Althorp, she got to work the way she had worked in politics. She brought in modern heating, modern bathrooms, carpeting, aggressive restoration of a house that had frankly been decaying. And she tried to make the estate pay for itself, with open days for the public, dinners, concerts, corporate events. By her own later estimate, keeping Althorp running required bringing in something like £500,000 a year, every year. That was where the 2 versions of the story split apart and never fully came back together. The same facts read 2 ways. From Raine's side, here was a magnificent old house with failing plumbing, worn-out rugs, no proper heating, and no income to sustain it. Those were not sacred relics. They were problems, and problems existed to be solved. From the children's side, those rooms were not a business plan. They were continuity. They were the one thing that had stayed the same while their parents' marriage came apart. So every sale, every redecoration, every modernization did not read as rescue. It read as one more thing being taken away, one more piece of home gone. Neither side was simply lying. That was the trap of the whole story. The same act saving the house could look like devotion from one angle and dispossession from the other. Then, just 2 years into the marriage, in 1978, everything changed again. Johnny had a stroke, a severe one, and it left lasting damage. It was Raine who nursed him through it. through her recovery that Johnny himself would later credit in large part to her care. He would go on to live another 14 years. It was the detail that made the Wicked Stepmother cartoon fall apart. Both things were true at once. The children could despise her, and she could still have been genuinely, tirelessly devoted to their father. Those two facts did not cancel each other out. They simply sat side by side, unbearably for years. The stroke also changed the shape of the household. The vigorous new countess became the nurse and the gatekeeper. The earl became physically dependent, and his children now had to reach their father through the very woman they resented. The cost of it showed years later, in 1981, when Johnny, still unsteady on his feet from the stroke, walked Diana down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral. That was Diana's own transformation. On the 29th of July, 1981, 20-year-old Diana married the Prince of Wales at St. Paul's, and the shy, aristocratic girl from Althorp became, almost instantly, one of the most watched women alive. The wedding mattered less as spectacle than as reversal. Diana had been a child who felt displaced in her own father's house. Now she outranked nearly everyone in it. The girl who had felt powerless against Raine was suddenly the most famous person the Spencer family had ever produced. It did not fix the grievance. Status does not reach back and repair a childhood. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, things were being sold out of Althorp. Contemporary reports named silver, furniture, and paintings, including a group of works by the great painter Van Dyck, said to number 11. Johnny pushed back publicly against the storyline that Raine had torn the family apart over these sales. Raine herself, later, did not deny that the sales happened. She insisted they were what Johnny wanted. Charles Spencer would eventually give a far harsher account of what Raine did to Althorp and how those decisions were made. That harsher account belongs in the story as Charles's interpretation of a feud he had lived inside, not as a settled, neutral verdict. When two sides of a family remember the same events this differently, the honest course is not to pick a winner. It is to hold both. Inside the house, the contrast was physical. The old portraits and inherited furniture on one side, the new carpet, the new heating, the new bathrooms on the other. It was not about anyone's taste. It was about what Diana and Charles saw every time they walked in. Evidence, everywhere, that someone else now held authority over what they still thought of as their house. The break in this family is often traced to the staircase. It came earlier than that. The real first fracture was quieter, and it was this. The day in 1976 that Raine arrived as Countess Spencer, and control of Althorp changed hands. Before Raine, the children's anger had nowhere to land. There was no way to shove a divorce down a staircase, no way to confront a custody ruling. The pain of their parents splitting up was real, but it was abstract. It had no face. Raine gave it a face. She was there. She was visible. She rearranged the rooms. She made the decisions. And hardest of all, she controlled access to the father they had already once been terrified of losing. All that free-floating grief from childhood finally had somewhere to go. It had a person, and the sibling nickname, the shared jokes. The little rituals of resistance did more than express the resentment. They hardened it into identity. Being against Raine became part of who they were as a family. For Diana, it landed even harder because Raine sat on top of two of her most sensitive places at once. Loyalty to her mother, the parent who had been pushed out, and Althorp itself, the symbol of the childhood stability she had never had. Raine, fairly or not, had come to represent a threat to both. And Johnny made the choice that guaranteed none of it could ever be simply resolved. He stayed. He defended her. He was openly grateful to her for saving his life after the stroke. There was no clean exit. The children could not win by persuading their father to pick them over his wife, because he was never going to. The gap between the two versions of the family was stark. From the outside, in the early 1980s, it looked like a triumph. An old aristocratic house lifted into global fame by a daughter who had married the future king. From the inside, the same house held old custody wounds that never healed, a stepmother the children openly mocked, a father whose illness had made him dependent on that stepmother, and an estate that demanded enormous amounts of cash simply to survive. The fairy tale and the wound were the same building. The image needs no invented confrontation. Raine moving through those rooms, giving instructions, deciding what stayed and what went, and Diana walking into the rooms she had known as a child and understanding, for the first time, that knowing a house by heart was not the same as controlling it. Familiarity had quietly stopped meaning belonging. By the end of the 1980s, this was where things stood. Diana's hatred of Raine was never one argument waiting to happen. It was an accumulation, layer on layer, year after year, for more than a decade. The absent mother, the lost custody, the stepmother in the doorway, the father who kept choosing her, the house sold off piece by piece, all of it stacking. And Diana was no longer only a wounded daughter carrying an old grievance. She was a grown woman, carrying something new because behind the palace walls, her own marriage had begun to come apart. A second family, breaking just like the first. The woman she blamed for tearing one family open was about to meet Diana at the exact moment the second one began to collapse. Through that whole decade, the two women had moved through their lives in opposite directions. Raine's world kept shrinking down to Althorp and to Johnny. His health, the endless cost of the estate, the restoration, the public openings, the sales. Her days were organized around keeping a fragile old man and a fragile old house standing. Diana's world went the other way, outward and upward and away. Away from Althorp, into royal marriage, into motherhood. William arrived in 1982, Harry in 1984, and into a level of global fame almost no one alive could match. What all that distance did not do was erase anything. A palace and a crown and hundreds of miles could sit between a person and a childhood grievance, and the grievance would simply wait. It did not age, it did not soften. And by the later 1980s, something the world did not yet know was happening behind the fairy tale marriage. Diana's own relationship with the Prince of Wales was deteriorating. People who were near her at the time of the confrontation believed she was under enormous pressure when it finally came. None of that excused what she did. A collapsing marriage did not make it acceptable to put hands on a woman of 60, but it helps explain the pressure behind the moment. Years of resentment and a private life quietly coming apart, held inside one person, waiting for a single event to light the fuse. That event was a wedding. On the 16th of September, 1989, Diana's brother Charles married the model Victoria Lockwood at St. Mary the Virgin Church in the village of Great Brington, Northamptonshire, the Spencer family's own parish church. The record of the day is mundane and specific. It rained, and the bride arrived at the church in her wedding dress in the wet. A society wedding, cameras outside, an aristocratic family performing in public exactly the thing it had never actually possessed. Continuity, marriage, the next generation, the unbroken line. And inside the house, in the days around that wedding, the oldest wound in the family tore wide open. The push itself has already been described. What set it off had not. The exact staging differs a little from account to account, who was where and what was said first, but the core is consistent. Diana was furious and not at bottom about furniture or money, though money and furniture were the words that came out. What set her off was her mother. Diana believed Raine had treated Frances, the woman pushed out of the family 2 decades earlier, with coldness, had slighted her, had, in Diana's eyes, ignored her. What the evidence supports is this. Raine's former assistant, a woman named Sue Howe, later described a confrontation on the landing. Diana pushed Raine, and Raine fell, and she was left bruised and deeply shaken. And this was not only one servant's memory. Diana herself, later on recordings, acknowledged that she had pushed Raine down the stairs and admitted she had taken satisfaction in doing it. The limits of the account are worth stating plainly. The precise words, the exact sequence of the fall, and how badly Raine was actually hurt are all less certain, but the central fact is unusually well supported for a private royal family story. It happened, and Diana confirmed it. It would be easy to stage the moment as a triumph, the wrong princess striking back at the wicked stepmother. It was nothing of the kind. Strip away the fairy tale, and what remained was a 28-year-old woman under enormous private strain, shoving a woman of 60 down a flight of stairs in a family argument. There was nothing triumphant in it. It was the moment a childhood loyalty conflict finally turned into an act of violence. And the fight revealed what it had always been about. The words Diana reportedly used were about the house, the money, her father. What had actually set her off was her mother. Althorp, Frances, Johnny, and Raine had fused in Diana's mind into one grievance that could not be pulled apart. The house was her father's love. The sales were her father's love being spent. Raine's coldness to Frances was the old wound reopening. It was all one thing, and when Raine, by every account, defended Johnny and pointed back at the pain Frances herself had caused him all those years before, she was, without meaning to, pressing on every bruise at once. Where it happened mattered. The family had gathered to celebrate a marriage dressed for the church, performing togetherness for the cameras. while behind the front door it reenacted the exact rupture that had blown their parents' generation apart. Outside, the society photographers got their pictures of the rain and the dress. Inside, the family was staring at a 20-year-old scar. For years, all of it had stayed more or less inside the family. The resentment, the nickname, the arguments, the sort of thing that in most aristocratic families would have died quietly behind thick old walls and never reached anyone. But this was not most families. This family contained the most photographed woman in the world. By 1991, the newspapers were openly running the story. Coverage described the sale of something like 200 objects from Althorp, and some of it laid the blame squarely on Raine, the acquisitive stepmother stripping the ancestral home. Johnny pushed back publicly. He rejected the whole wicked stepmother framing outright, and he insisted the decisions had been his as well, not Raine acting alone. That was the structural turn. A private family quarrel had leaked into the public bloodstream. Because Diana was who she was, a dispute that in any other family would have stayed an obscure argument about furniture became part of the machinery of royal press coverage, reprinted, dramatized, and handed to the public in the shape it liked best: a villain and a victim. There was no moment when the family sat down to repair any of it, no mediation, no organized reconciliation, before Johnny died. There was a narrower failure worth naming, though, and it was communication. Each side had settled so deeply into its own story that there was no room left for the other person's version to be true. 3 versions existed at once, and each contained something the record supported. Diana and Charles held that Raine had invaded their home, spent their father's money, and come between them and their father. Raine held that she had loved Johnny, kept him alive after his stroke, and done the hard, unglamorous work required to keep an impossibly expensive house from collapsing. Johnny held that the sales and the restoration had been his decisions as much as hers. All 3 at the same time, all partly true. There was no clean villain to find, and that was precisely why it could never be resolved by argument. Everyone, in their own frame, was right. The feud had reached the point of physical violence. But the thing that finally changed it was not another fight. It was a loss. The loss of the one person all of them had been fighting over. On the 21st of March, 1992, Johnny Spencer was admitted to a hospital in London. He had pneumonia. The day before he went in, Diana and her 9-year-old son William had visited him. Then Diana left the country, flying to Austria for a skiing holiday with her sons. And when she left, the reports were that her father seemed to be recovering. He was expected to be fine. The ordinariness of it was the most human part of the whole story. A grandfather in a hospital bed, looking as though he was on the mend. A 9-year-old grandson at his bedside, a daughter kissing him goodbye and heading off on a family holiday, not remotely believing it was the last time. On the 29th of March, after a heart attack, Johnny Spencer died in that London hospital. He was 68 years old. The reliable public record does not give a well-established time of death, and inventing one would be a disservice. What survives is enough. A ski holiday, a father everyone thought was recovering, and then the call from London. That single death meant something different to each person around it because the whole feud had been held in tension by this one man, and the moment he was gone, the tension had nowhere to go. For Diana, 30 years old, it was the death of the parent she had actually grown up with, the father who had kept the children after the custody battle, the one who had walked her down the aisle on unsteady legs. For Raine, 62, it was the death of the man she had left a long marriage for, the man she had nursed back from a stroke that should have killed him, the center of 16 years of her life. For Charles, 27, it meant something immediate and enormous. He was now the 9th Earl Spencer, and Althorp, the house, the debts, the whole impossible machine was his. And for Frances, the absent mother, it closed one of the most painful chapters of her own life. The man who had held all those competing loyalties in one uneasy balance was gone, and the balance collapsed with him. What happened next survives in a vivid version and a verifiable one, and they are not quite the same. Multiple later accounts agree on the core. With Johnny dead, the Spencer children moved fast to get Raine out of the house. Then there's the vivid part, reported by The Independent, that Diana had Raine's clothes packed into rubbish bags and that Charles kicked those bags down the stairs. That image belongs in the story as reported recollection, not as verified minute-by-minute fact. What Raine herself later confirmed was the narrower version, that she was not allowed to remove things from Althorp without first proving they were hers to take. Even the narrower version lands hard because of the staircase. 3 years earlier, Diana had pushed Raine down those stairs, Now, by these accounts, it was Raine's belongings going down them, as she lost her place in the house entirely. The same staircase, the same fall made into a metaphor. Johnny did not, however, leave her with nothing. Later reports put Raine's inheritance at around £4 million, along with a home in Mayfair, one profile valuing that house at roughly £1.5 million. Those were reported figures, not audited estate accounts, but the point stands. This was not a woman thrown penniless into the street. The real loss was not financial. It was everything else. And there was a bitter irony underneath all of it, one that took years to fully surface. Charles, the brother who had resented Raine most for treating the sacred family house like a business, inherited the exact same problem. Later reporting described Althorp losing something like £450,000 a year under his stewardship, forcing him to sell assets and rights just to fund essential work. It did not retroactively bless every decision Raine had made, but it quietly demolished the fantasy the children had been living inside, the idea that Althorp could simply be preserved, untouched forever, if only the stepmother would stop selling things. It could not. The house was always going to demand painful choices. Raine had only been the first one asked to make them, and the first one blamed for it. Two scenes set side by side. On the 29th of March, 1992, Diana in Austria learned that the father she had just visited, the father she thought was recovering, was dead. And at Althorp after the funeral, Raine, the woman who had run the house for 16 years, who knew every room and every account and every problem, stood inside it and could no longer assume that a single object in it belonged to her. The devastating part was not the bags, it was the collapse of standing. The day before, she had been the Countess Spencer, the mistress of Althorp, the woman whose word ran the house. Now Johnny was dead, Charles was the Earl, and every scrap of authority that had ever protected Raine's place in the family had died with the one man who granted it. On the surface, the feud was over. Johnny was dead. Raine was out of the house, out of the family, out of the authority she had held for 16 years. Diana and Charles had, in the coldest sense, won. The stepmother they had spent their youth wanting gone was finally actually gone. Diana should have been free of her. It should have been the end. But outside Althorp, in Diana's own life, the real story was about to turn. Her marriage was no longer deteriorating. It was ending. Within months, her separation from the Prince of Wales would be public, splashed across the same newspapers that had once painted Raine as the villain. And Diana was about to learn from the inside exactly what it felt like to have a marriage fail, to be publicly cast as a character in someone else's story, to fight over children and loyalty and belonging while the whole world watched. Everything that had once made Raine incomprehensible to her. The divorce, the second marriage, the hostile children, the public shaming. Diana was about to live through herself. The experience that had made these two women enemies was about to become the one thing they shared. And the next time Diana reached out to Raine, it would not be to push her down a staircase. It would be to invite her to lunch. In 1992, the Prince and Princess of Wales formally separated, and Diana found herself living inside the very thing she had never understood about Raine, a marriage failing in public. Loyalties pulled in every direction. Her most private relationships turned into newspaper narratives, dramatized and sold, with the world deciding who was the hero and who the villain. For 17 years, Raine's life, the divorce, the remarriage, the stepchildren who despised her, the press casting her as a schemer, had been incomprehensible to Diana. It was no longer incomprehensible. It was Diana's own life. And so, in 1993, according to the account later given by the writer Tina Brown, Diana did something that would have been unthinkable even a couple of years earlier. She reached out to Raine. She invited her stepmother, the woman she had shoved down a staircase, the woman whose belongings she had reportedly had bagged up and removed from Althorp, to lunch at Kensington Palace, Diana's home. Raine, by that account, was not sure what she was walking into. She brought her new French fiancé, Jean-François de Chambrun, arriving braced, perhaps, for tension, maybe even an ambush. No reliable exact date survives for that lunch, so it belongs simply to 1993. But the geography of it told a story. For 17 years, the battleground had been Raine's control of Diana's childhood home, and every fight had been, in some sense, about whose house Althorp really was. Now Diana was inviting Raine into her house. She held the power. She set the table. And this was the part the reconciliation had to earn rather than announce. Diana had not woken one morning and decided the previous 17 years had not happened. She had not forgiven the childhood or the sales or the sense of displacement. What had shifted was narrower and truer and much harder to admit. She had finally come to accept one fact she had spent her whole life resisting. Raine really had loved her father. The Guardian's later obituary records the substance of what Diana eventually expressed to her: gratitude. She thanked Raine for having cared for Johnny. She acknowledged that Raine had genuinely loved him. It was an enormous concession, coming from the woman who had built her entire understanding of Raine on the opposite premise, that she was a cold operator who had married a title. It did not stop at that one lunch. The two of them became close, genuinely close. Raine later described Diana sitting on her sofa and telling her about her troubles, her marriage, her fears, her private life. Other accounts have them meeting again and again at the Connaught Grill in Mayfair, the most photographed, most pursued woman on earth, quietly confiding in the stepmother she had once loathed. There was a reason that particular relationship worked, and Raine herself named it. Years later, at the 2007 inquest into Diana's death, Raine testified that Diana valued the fact that she had, in Raine's words, no hidden agenda. It was a loaded phrase. For Diana, almost every relationship came tangled up with a question. What do you want from me? Access, status, a story to sell, proximity to fame. Nearly everyone who came close wanted something. And Raine, the woman once cast as the ultimate schemer, turned out to be one of the very few people in Diana's life who wanted nothing from her at all. There is a psychological symmetry here worth sitting with as inference rather than fact. Diana had spent her youth seeing Raine as the woman who stood between her and her father, between the family that was and the family that broke. When Diana's own marriage collapsed, Raine became something else, one of the very few older women in her world who had actually lived through divorce, remarriage, resentful stepchildren, and a hostile press turning private pain into public spectacle. Raine had survived every one of those things. There was no one better to sit across from, on a quiet sofa in Mayfair, than the one person who had already been through the exact fire. For a while, the reconciliation was only rumor. Then it stopped being rumor because it was photographed. On the 28th of March, 1997, Diana and Raine lunched together at the Connaught in Mayfair, two women leaving a restaurant. Close, comfortable, ordinary. And on the 2nd of June, 1997, they were photographed together again, this time at Christie's, the auction house, at a private viewing of Diana's dresses ahead of a charity auction that would benefit AIDS and cancer causes. Diana was giving away the gowns of her life as Princess of Wales. The feud that had consumed the family for 2 decades had been, in large part, a war about objects leaving Althorp. The silver, the furniture, the paintings, everything Raine sold, and everything the children mourned. Now those same two women stood side by side, while Diana voluntarily gave away the objects of her own former life, on her own terms, for causes she had chosen herself. There is no evidence Diana consciously drew the connection, but the parallel hung in the air of that auction house. The woman who had once burned over a family's possessions, being disposed of now, stood beside the person she had blamed for it, calmly deciding what from her own past she was ready to release. She had arrived, in a sense, at Raine's old understanding that sometimes releasing what you own is not a theft and not a betrayal, but simply how a person moves forward. Almost no time later, it was over. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana died in the car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. The cruelty of the timing is hard to overstate. The reconciliation with Raine had been given only a handful of years, and its warmest, most visible phase, the lunches and the confidences and the photographs, had lasted barely a fraction of that. They had found their way back to each other, and then the time ran out. Diana's two elder sisters, Sarah and Jane, accompanied her coffin home from Paris. After the funeral at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of September, Diana was taken back to Althorp, the house at the center of the entire story, and buried on the small island in the middle of the ornamental lake. There was one last quiet irony in that. The stepdaughter who had spent so much of her youth wanting Raine gone from the Spencer family was, in the end, laid to rest permanently at the very estate Raine had worked so hard and been so resented for trying to save. Raine outlived her stepdaughter by nearly 2 decades. She stayed active well into old age, including work connected to the department store Harrods. In 2007, she gave evidence at the inquest into Diana's death, and it was there, on the record, that she described the intimacy the two of them had finally reached. The sofa, the confidences, the trust. Raine died in London on the 21st of October, 2016, at 87. After her death, her own personal collection went to auction, and it is worth being precise about this, because it would be easy to muddle. That later sale was Raine's own belongings, from her own life. It had nothing to do with the Althorp sales of the 1980s and 90s that had caused the feud. They were two separate things, and conflating them would tell a lie about the story. In 2017, the year after Raine died, the British broadcaster Channel 4 aired a documentary called Princess Diana's Wicked Stepmother, framing exactly this arc, from bitter conflict to unlikely reconciliation. That the Wicked Stepmother label survived all the way to a television title is itself part of the story, because it is easy to see why the stereotype held on. Raine handed the fairy tale everything it needed: the flamboyant appearance, the sculpted hair and the pearls, the romance novelist mother, the inherited money, the titles, the redecorated ancestral rooms, the famous stepdaughter. She looked like a villain out of a storybook, and the world loves a storybook villain. But the documented record is stubborn, and it does not fit the storybook. A serious political career, decades of genuine heritage and preservation work, a man nursed back from a stroke that nearly killed him and given 14 more years of life. And at the very end, the gratitude of the same stepdaughter who had spent her youth wanting her gone. The simple version is available to anyone who wants it. Holding it requires ignoring a great deal. Nearly 3 decades on, this is where the story stands. Charles Spencer is 62, still the 9th Earl Spencer, still the custodian of Althorp. In May 2026, he married the archaeologist Kat Jarman, his 4th marriage. Althorp is still in Spencer hands. It still opens its doors to visitors, still presenting more than 5 centuries of family history to anyone who walks through them. The house outlasted them all, and the great irony has closed its circle. Charles, who resented Raine most for treating the house like a business, inherited the same impossible arithmetic, the estate reportedly bleeding hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, forcing him to sell assets and rights just to keep it standing. The very thing he had condemned in Raine, he came to do himself. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's eldest surviving sister, is 71. She has largely stayed out of the celebrity glare, surfacing mostly for royal occasions or to support her nephews. In 2025, she suffered a serious fall from her horse and spent a long stretch in hospital recovering. Lady Jane Fellows, born in 1957, has kept an even quieter profile. Both sisters remained woven into the aftermath of Diana's death. It was Sarah and Jane who brought their sister's coffin home from Paris, and Sarah who went on to work connected to Diana's memorial fund. Frances Shand Kidd, the mother at the emotional root of it all, the woman whose treatment triggered the staircase confrontation, died in 2004 at 68, and there was a final sadness threaded through even that. Her own relationship with Diana had turned strained again before Diana's death, one more mother and daughter thread in a family where reconciliation so often arrived late, if it arrived at all. Raine died in 2016, Diana in 1997, Johnny in 1992. Every person at the center of the original triangle is gone. Only the house remains, the one thing they all fought over, and the one thing still standing. It is tempting to end a story like this with a verdict, to decide at last whether Raine was good or bad, whether Diana was right or wrong to hate her. But that is the wrong question, and reaching for it misses what the whole thing was about. It was never really a fight about a woman. It was a fight about a house, and about everything a house like that can be made to mean. Inheritance, belonging, money, memory, and underneath all of it, the right to decide what a family keeps and what it is allowed to let go. Diana believed Raine had taken something from her. Her father, her home, the continuity she never had. Raine believed she was preserving something for all of them. Both of them had a real claim on the truth, and neither was the villain the other needed. It took the death of the man they were fighting over and the collapse of Diana's own marriage before either's certainty began to loosen. Before Diana could look at Raine and see at last not a schemer, but a woman who had loved and lost the same man she had. The image to end on is not the staircase, and not the two of them frozen at the top of those steps at the worst moment between them. It is a doorway in Mayfair, on an ordinary gray afternoon in March 1997, Diana in her pale gray suit, Raine beside her in pearls and turquoise, the cameras waiting, and not the faintest sign that these two had once believed there was nothing left between them but hatred. Two women who had finally run out of reasons to be enemies leaving lunch together.